just a really brief introduction to Women in AI UK. So we're a global nonprofit community focused on supporting and elevating women in AI through education, mentorship, and community engagement. So our UK chapter runs mentoring programs. We have networking opportunities and different initiatives to help women build skills and leadership in AI. And just so you know, this spring series continues beyond today. So we'll have another webinar next month that we're excited about as well. Would love to see you there. But now really delighted to introduce our speaker of today. So we're just super honored to be joined by Professor Alan Jagolinzer, Professor of Financial Accounting at Cambridge Judge Business School. His research focuses on governance, regulation, and how emerging technologies, including AI, are reshaping transparency, accountability, and trust in modern systems. We were just chatting before we joined, and he's just super passionate about this topic and about getting the word out. So, really thrilled to have him here. So, today he'll be speaking on seeing is no longer believing, how synthetic media is reshaping our reality. I think it'll be a really interesting topic that just touches everybody and things that happen in our day-to-day lives. So, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Alan, and he'll present some slides and thinking, and then we'll do a bit of guided discussion and open it up to your questions and just kind of dig into such an interesting and important topic.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with all of you. I'm obsessed about this, and I think so. I think before we get into kind of the specifics to the AI and synthetic media, what I usually do is I have to talk about the human problem first. So I have to set the setup so everybody understands what we're really dealing with and how AI and some of the synthetic media and the social media amplifies sort of the architecture for the degradation of information and the cognitive manipulation of society, and some of the downstream risks. And this is some of the work that we've been doing. A little bit of context. The work I do is on information integrity as a financial accountant. We try to preserve integrity of market information so that people don't get duped. Also, we need to be able to trust transactions in markets, like buying a car or buying a stock, things like that. And if we have people lying and manipulating systems like that, then markets can break down and we can't even trust each other to do transactions. So these are some of the systemic risks I've been working on, including things like counter fraud. And as I started expanding scope, I started realizing that there's a fundamental toolkit to the manipulation game that's been used throughout history and across settings. And we did a lot of deconstruction about what that is. And then it's all been amplified and accelerated by social media, by AI technology, and some of these other tools. And so that's kind of where I start in and break this down. I also lead the Cambridge Disinformation Summit, which I would communicate as an aggregation of some of the world's leading scientists who touch the human condition: law, linguistics, theology, sociology, anthropology, business, literally journalism, any angle on this problem we try to bring to the table, because this is, to me, the most complex human problem there is, and it affects literally every other human problem. Information corruption and corrosion makes solving any problem incredibly difficult. So if we're going to try to deal with things like forced migration, if we're going to try to deal with things like solving pollution and climate risks, all the systemic risks are amplified and accelerated by bad information. And it's even worse when there are some actors who are intentionally polluting that information stream. So what I want to get clear really quickly is that the world runs on emotional fuel. And I always open every talk with this quote attributed to Maya Angelou, who says, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." So we are in an emotional discussion. Likewise, my former boss, I was a US military pilot. My former boss was Peggy Carnahan. I'll never forget. She was a little bit cheeky here, so this isn't this extreme, but she told me never bring emotion to a logic battle and never bring logic to an emotion battle. And I sense that we're really in an emotion battle right now. And so when we introduce logic and fact checking, it doesn't always resonate because people are in their emotions, not necessarily ready to take on the logic. And so I'll bring that in the discussion as we go forward. Some of it, what we're dealing with today too, societally, is cognitive paralysis. There are a lot of people who are frozen, either because they just don't believe it's as bad as it is, or because they're just processing this cognitive dissonance of shock, like, this I don't know what to do because it's so overwhelming. Some of that shock is intentionally placed. And if you're in cognitive paralysis, then you don't act. And we saw this a lot when we were dealing with emergencies and some survival training that I did in the military, where they would try to get us to be paralyzed in fear, in panic, being overwhelmed, so that we couldn't do anything. And so a lot of what I'm seeing right now is cognitive dissonance and this pain of, what do I do? I'm overwhelmed. And so a lot of what I try to do is get people like CEOs or leaders who can actually act on interventions to process this cleanly so that we can move them into action. We're also quite literally in cognitive war. We haven't chosen to be in cognitive war, it found us. And I don't use this term loosely. It is by definition warfare. If you go into Clausewitz, there are people who are currently deploying war in a real sense, in a kinetic sense. Vladimir Putin would be one. But there's also this sort of war in the concept of, I want you to capitulate to my frame of view, my worldview. I want you to relinquish your agency to me. And so, by definition, any kind of zero sum tactics where I will deploy any opportunity to manipulate so that you surrender your agency, that is by definition warfare. And we see this in corporate, we see this also in social environments. But I think it's incredibly important that my assessment, and I'm not the only one to assess this, because I've worked with leading authoritarian scholars and I've also worked with senior people in military, that we are in a hybrid war. And I use hybrid loosely to suggest any means of trying to obtain dominant power that is not kinetic. By kinetic, it's violent. So we're not necessarily using violent forms, but this could be extortion, gaslighting, disinformation, financial pressure, legal pressure. There's all kinds of ways that I can try to capitulate you to my will. We just recently held a session with Chad Briggs. It's on our YouTube page. I highly recommend you watch it. He is an expert on cognitive warfare, and he basically says that at least one objective in cognitive warfare is to try to get paralysis. So they try to create a landscape where actors are trying to get people to freeze and to just not know what to do or to be fatigued. And so emotional manipulation and confusion can get people to just stop in their tracks and give up. And I think that's part of the win, if you will. If you can imagine somebody who wants to maneuver around us, then if we're frozen in our cognitive feelings or overwhelm and or panic, then we can't act against what they're trying to do. If you want some reading, these are some books that I recommend. One of them, this Nerdreich, has not yet been released, but these are some of the reading that I've been doing in this space, and I think this can help color this. I don't want to speak too much about cognitive warfare anymore, but I want to move into sort of how this happens and then bring in where the technology plays. So, how our brains work fundamentally is we tend to see events that are observational, and all of us can see the exact same event, but then each of us individually writes a story to that event internally in our inner dialogue, and then we instantly assign emotions to those stories. And I'll give you some examples. We will all come up with different stories typically. So here's an observation. We can take it from the perspective of the woman in the background. She's observing this gentleman on the phone. And so there are a whole array of stories that might be generated. He's ignoring me, which might generate sadness and resentment. He's dealing with a real problem right now, which might generate concern, things like that, um, depending on the perspective. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Another one is you send a text to a partner or romantic partner, "Where are you?" and it's not answered. So imagine this being in the middle of the night. They're cheating on me might be one story, which then gets sadness, resentment. They're in the hospital, which gets concern. Their phone battery died again, frustration, disappointment. These are the kinds of stories and emotions that each one of us might assign to that exact same observation. I like this one too. This is simply a Tesla on fire. And depending on your perspective, there are stories, and I usually do this in class in an interaction, but I'm just trying to do this for time. They crashed, which would get sadness, concern, maybe. The battery exploded. There's concern for the owner, anger for the manufacturer. It was vandalism. And you might actually enjoy it if for some reason you don't like Tesla, maybe perhaps because of the emotional connection to the CEO. You might have other reasons to generate emotions around it if it were vandalism. The reason why I bring this up is because all of these stories and emotions are identified and heavily influenced by so many factors that we call in the organizational behavior and organizational design literature the observer. Each individual enters in with a worldview and a lived experience that heavily informs the stories and emotions they assign to an observation everybody has. So my parental upbringing, my religious upbringing, education, culture, friends, prior traumas are heavily influencing this. Of, how I feel physically, things like that. They're influencing these things. And this is one reason why we'll all each show up with very different stories and emotions. And particularly when you get to things like hey, they haven't responded to my text. Often, if you've had a prior trauma where somebody's cheated on you or they haven't responded because they've been with some other partner, then we might reach to that trauma and then project it into this event more readily. Because we are used to a pattern of cheating, we might reach to that story instead of exploring other stories. Why am I bringing this up? Because these stories and emotions are almost always misinformed. Often we don't have enough information to really know what the story is. And this gets into settings, for example, where the observation is that there was a shooting near the White House. That's the observation. Nobody knows the story yet. Some people have partial stories because they were eyewitnesses. Other people are speculating. And the problem is that then the stories and the emotions can get immediately generated in the social media space based on biases, based on incentives, based on, it's going to be this outgroup. Obviously, it's terrorism, and it's this outgroup that's driving it. Things like that. We see this in major current events, airplane crashes or other things where people are like, oh, I have a story, and they push it in there. And these are almost always misinformed, and they require more information. They typically require time and they require evidence to help inform them properly. But that's slow. And there are people who are, in my opinion, malign actors who really want a specific story because they have a specific agenda, and they will then push stories and emotions into the influence space to try to get energy around their version of the story and the emotions, even if it's completely unfactual. So a lot of this is to try to navigate and narrate the stories and the assignment of emotions as part of the influence campaign in order to get some objective or to get a movement going. I'll talk briefly about movements in a minute. So some examples of malign actors and some of how they flood stories and emotions are the Russian fire hose of falsehood, the flood the zone with shit tactic, which Steve Bannon is known for. For those of you who aren't familiar, he's a U.S. Populist, opportunist populist who has led a bunch of campaigns, including Brexit, and has helped support the first administration or the first election campaign for Donald Trump as examples. So these are types of examples where, they're pushing out stories, they're pushing out emotions, and they're doing it presumably with some objective and agenda. What's also important is that he himself, in a podcast taping he did, which I actually recommend, from January of 2025, I have a copy of it, and there's a link below here to it. He talks about visceral messaging. And by definition, visceral means it's cutting deeply into emotional provocation. It's intentionally provocative. And he's doing it for a reason because that's going to land. We're going to talk a little bit about dopamine in a minute. But this is sort of a tactic that is now highly widely deployed, and it's designed to cut through and really agitate people and get them emotionally stirred up. So this is choosing language that is specifically trying to drive the biggest emotional interaction with the story. So there's this intention to really stoke deep emotions here. we're not going to listen to the thing. And the visceral messaging that I see quite frequently, especially in the UK, rape gangs is one. Just even using the word rape and then adding the word gang to it is a very powerful, visceral, very deep cutting kind of language. Eating dogs and cats, pedophiles, vermin, regular use of profanity, heavy use of tropes, unapologetically, super provocative, the words that cut through, the words that make people react, words that are forbidden. This is intentionally chosen, and this is literally what he says is part of their strategy. There's also this documentary. I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but I like this documentary, Bad Influence. It was like three episodes, I think. And what was interesting was these were a bunch of kid influencers who just did a lot of social stuff. There wasn't anything particularly wrong about what they were doing. It was just sort of cheeky interaction and cross promotion of them doing, silly things. What was interesting though is they started as this thing evolved. They talk about how the main influence character was a teenage girl. I think her name was Piper, if I remember. But the point was as they evolved their presence in order for her to retain her audience and grow it, she became more provocative. And they said she even started doing less clothing over time. To where she was like wearing like bikinis, I think at 16 years old, just to retain audience. So this whole idea of doing like a lot more shock and a lot more uh, um, if you will, provocative things to retain audience. One of the reasons why I think, and one of the best books that's out there right now is this Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke, who's a Stanford neuroscientist, psychiatrist. She also has a video that we have partially linked on our YouTube page, which I highly recommend. And she talks about how when we take a hit of dopamine, we need a resting period afterwards to reset the dopamine mechanism. And if we don't, then if we continually stimulate the dopamine, for example, in the doom scrolling on X or on Instagram, then we need higher levels of the same stimulus to get the same level of dopamine. So it is in her words like an addiction. And the idea here is that the visceral thing has to happen in order to retain the audience. In order to retain the audience, like they have to keep getting more and more and more provocative to get the same level of dopamine hit over time. We become desensitized to the standard messaging. And that's what I see is happening in the online discourse space. Now we're going to move into disinformation briefly. I'll define it very quickly. But a lot of this is also disinforming. And one of the things, this is where AI now will make a pop. What I've been dealing with prior to this is disinformation by definition, and I have the definition that we did with the World Economic Forum coming up, is there's an intentional actor, there's a messenger who is intentionally manipulating the narrative to influence a vulnerable targeted audience for exploitation. So they intend to do harm with the messaging. Misinformation is the lack of intention. It could be accidental. It could be misinformed. It could be me thinking I know what's correct, but really not knowing what's correct. Or it could be me following a disinformation actor, trusting them wrongly and sharing their lie that was intentionally placed. But disinformation is a malicious act by intention to harm. And I have also said disinformation publicly is fundamentally, in most cases, a preparatory act to bait somebody in for corruption. So we see disinformation, for example, grooming as a grooming speech act to lure somebody in to trust them, to defraud them with crypto, to defraud them in a financial deal, to sexually assault them for example, a grooming case for sexual assault, things like that. So what's interesting though is most of this stuff has been done on the story and emotion level. And so a lot of this stuff is to manipulate our understanding of an observation that we've both shared. What's really important now, where AI will start coming in, is now the observation itself can be manipulated. And we can tailor the observation now by person. And so we can sit here and even have doubt about whether we're seeing the same thing. And that is even more problematic because now I can manipulate the entire cognitive chain. I can manipulate the observation and the story and the emotion, and that is hyper dangerous. And we could talk more about that in the Q&A. I mentioned what disinformation is. I did a write-up with the World Economic Forum. We're going to do more follow-up work. I highly recommend this site. We put a lot of care into this, and we talk a lot about this. I'm not going to go into much about this now. Um, but some of the stuff that we took away just for time, so we can get to Q&A in a minute, is we just held the 2026 Cambridge Disinformation Summit. This is the third in our series, and we're now already planning the next one. But we had input across the political spectrum with takeaways. And I think one of the key takeaways is that what we're really talking about is corruption. So a lot of the discussion has been on the speech and the narratives and, free speech and all that stuff. But really, fundamentally, by definition, if I'm disinforming you, I'm corrupting you. I'm doing corruptive work. And so a lot of the discussion that we're trying to work on is elevating the discourse away, not just focus on the narrative, but focus on the actors and the incentives and what the manipulation objective is so that maybe we can bring in different interventions like criminal interventions. Like we can bring in criminal prosecution for a bigger harm. And so this is some of the work that we're doing. So just being aware that by definition, disinformation is really about corruption. Social media infrastructure is designed for hate and rage profiteering, which also increases violence risk. And then there is algorithmic asymmetry that is offering more power to influencers who set the political agenda. We can talk more about that later. AI also plays a role here too, because a lot of the AI apps in the context, so AI is now playing a role not only in manufacturing fake things to look at, but AI is also having a role in helping us build connection to this thing to soothe anxiety. A lot of this demand for disinformation is to soothe anxiety. We're anxious about our identity, like where do I fit in the world? What's my role in life? We're also anxious about the future. Am I going to be able to survive? Can I make money? What's this pandemic going to do to me? So there's a lot of anxiety out there, and people go to the internet to learn, and then they're met with bad influence there because often some of the best influencers aren't there. One of the reasons, by the way, we're doing these webinars is so that we can meet them there too. So the AI relationship apps in particular are insidious because they're collecting data from people who are really, really, really vulnerable in many cases. They're lonely, and so they're doing relationships with AI, and then they're revealing personal secrets or they're revealing sexual discussions, which could then potentially be used for blackmail or extortion. We don't know where the data is being held. We don't know whether the data is being sold. They also have sycophant problems, and I think there's a whole array of problems around AI, including one of the things that I've been learning about recently is there are apps now to confess your sins in a religious context. And I'm like, pastoral care for that is incredibly important. I can only imagine what it must be like dealing with shame around sins in a religious context, putting it into an app, and then the app goes to who? Who owns it? Where's that data going? What are they going to do with that data? How are they going to manipulate me? Are they going to try to upsell me something? Are they going to try to blackmail me with that? There's so many dangers there with that piece we can talk about more later. And then the potential risks and harms are acute for children, but actually even more important, um, seniors. Seniors are really getting targeted with this, and also members of communities who are regularly being targeted, which includes, all the marginalized communities. We had representation of Muslim communities and Black communities in at the summit as examples, but it's really anybody that's traditionally targeted are getting even hammered with some of this stuff. So very briefly before we close and go to Q&A, who has influence? It's incredibly important to recognize who has influence. And AI will be reintroduced here in a second. But the trust in the traditional media is shattered. And this is one of the problems with a lot of our politicians is they don't get it. They're still trying to write to the New York Times. They're still trying to get in front of BBC cameras, which I think is important. But they don't realize that this is all happening here face to face. People are looking at the camera saying, "Hi, I'm Alan. I really want to get to know you." And they're staring at this, and it feels like this is a real close relationship with a close friend. And there's this notion of familiarity through parasocial engagement. And if the politicians like Keir Starmer and other politicians aren't doing this kind of work, or if we as academics aren't meeting people there, having conversations, then we're missing out because the other people are there and they're building these relationships. I'm not going to show the video, but this video is one influencer specifically, and she showed up in my YouTube feed, and I use her in class where we deconstruct what she does. But for brevity, I'll just tell you what she does. She says, I'm going to show you how to build millions of followers. So there's nothing wrong with what she's doing in my assessment. She's just like, hey, I'm going to show you how to build followers. And then she's super relatable. She gives a perception that she's super friendly. She's approachable. More importantly, she does an empowerment bid. She's like, I'm here for you. I'm here to help you. I really want to help you. You can do this too. And she's trying to feed empowerment to an audience that is probably very vulnerable. Opportunity, empathy, inclusion. So she talks a lot about community. She makes it feel like friendship. And there's like a common interest in values. And to keep in mind that this is a perception, this doesn't have to be real. And it doesn't have to be authentic. It just has to feel authentic. And now we see politicians and certain political actors going down this pathway, and they're promising the world. And some of this is by saying, hey, if you join me and if you hate this out group, then you get empowerment, right? So if you join my hate system, then you get all this opportunity. And you can be part of my team, right? And so there's a whole tribalistic thing that can be used here too with some of these influencers. AI is now playing in this too. This is a AI 19-year-old AI, very famous apparently, millions of followers. And I found this because I was like, who is this? And everything in this video, which I won't show you for brevity, is, hey, we're part of my community. You're part of my community. We belong together. If you're part of this, we get to be part of this fun thing. And then her lifestyle, mind you, this is all manufactured. Her lifestyle is I jetted off to Brazil, I jetted off to Paris. Now I'm a singer. So she's creating like this fantasy, and it's done fast paced, like a music video. It's a very high end production. And what's really fascinating about this is one where data can inform exactly what tone of voice and what body image will resonate with the targeted audience because we already have revealed our preferences for this kind of thing through what we do online. So there's enough data for us, for a manufacturer to literally precisely say, I'm going to choose this voice. And what struck me about her is her voice really drew in. There was something about the choice of the artificial voice that I was like, whoa, there's something about how it resonates. And that immediately caught me. And I realized that that was completely by design, right? Like they decided what voice will draw people in and feel right and feel comfortable. Also, when I ask people in my classes, okay, so with whom are you interacting here? And they're like, oh, the avatar, the AI. And I'm like, really? The AI is just code. So with whom are you interacting? And what we've learned through the summit is actually you're probably interacting with some worker in Africa who's getting paid wages that are below living wage, who is dealing with mental health breakdown, and who is actively coding the AI to make their own job obsolete. That was part of our summit. In addition, you're also communicating with the owner, and I have no idea who owns this system. So there is one company, and I don't think she's part of it, Replika, Replika, and they do a lot of AI stuff, and I'm not accusing them of anything wrong here. I'm just telling you what I know about them. They are offering like social interaction, and they are offering also, I think, some sort of semi-therapeutic engagement with AI. I pulled their terms of service, and their terms of service say they can do literally anything with your data. So I'm now having a romantic relationship with an app, which people do, and I'm not judging them for that. But whatever I'm doing in that interaction, they own. I have no idea what they're doing with it, let alone therapy. So imagine in the therapy, and by the way, on the therapy thing, I want to point out, and I promise I'll shut down. I know there's questions building in the chat. I promise I'll finish in a minute to get to the questions. When we were in the pandemic, there was a proliferation of online human virtual therapy, which I thought was a very viable business product for people who really needed it. There was a young master's student in Georgetown University who I found her paper, and it was really profound. She said that those those therapy, now again, this was human to human, forget about AI at that point. The human to human therapists were not bound by the legal rules for Healthcare Privacy Act in the United States. And that data was being sold on the black market. So you can imagine suicidation, all kinds of problems, all kinds of discussions and things like that. That just the privacy issues alone are very difficult for me to get my head around. Just so you're aware of that. And then what are the takeaways? So then I'll move into the takeaways for a moment. I, we are in a cognitive war environment, and I highly recommend you study that. And I don't use that term hyperbolically. It is by definition true. And if you talk to anybody who's a cognitive war expert, we're in a cognitive war environment. And I want to make it clear that war does not have to be declared by a nation state against another nation state. We see war by definition with neighbors sometimes over land rights and things like that. And again, war is just I want to capitulate somebody else. I want to take away their rights or their will or their power. This is a billion-dollar influence industry, billions, and some of it is tax subsidized in the United States. You're very likely already suffering from spillover effects. That's obvious. A lot of the standard countermeasures don't really have a lot of resonance. I think they're very important to do. I don't want to dismiss debunking and fact checking. I think they're critically important, but they're not cutting through. They're just not. People need, so I'm going back to this word visceral. We can only cut through if they're emotionally connective. People need, again, dopamine hit, people aren't attending to it. If it doesn't hit emotionally, people aren't grabbing. And I'm finding that I have to be even more visceral in even how I teach to get people off their phones. So we have a lot of discussion about whether to have your phone or your laptop in class. And I'm like, look, I'm just going to be put on a performance and I'll grab people's attention and I will be intentionally provocative and they'll watch me. So the narratives that we need to bring to the table, I think, can be authentically, not manipulatively, authentically emotionally visceral. Humor works really well. So we're starting to see that in campaigns, for example, by the governor of California. Sarcasm, blunt. I'm very blunt now. I speak very bluntly. I don't apologize for being blunt. And then I think also trauma bonding is a very good way of connecting with people. And I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of those messages there. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about a movement. This goes back to the discussion of emotion. In order for there to be systemic change, I think we need to have movements. And the movement is a deployment of collective power to engage for a specific purpose. And it requires alignment and clarity of shared values and emotional resonance. If you don't have emotional resonance, there is no movement. If you don't have clarity of shared values, there is no movement. And if you don't have alignment on values, there's no movement. The movements can be evil and corrupting. And many of the best corruptive movements, which are happening online, which are also leveraging AI, have clarity of shared values. Some of them are tribal, some of them are dehumanizing, but they're clear in their alignment and they have very strong emotional resonance that is intentionally placed. And that's why they work. I'm going to close there and then we can ask any questions from there. Thank you for the time. And then we can fold AI in and all the other questions here. So
Yeah,
hopefully that works.
amazing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alan. That was really fascinating. And I'd love to be in your more provocative classroom settings if this is what we get only on a Zoom. Getting it in person would be really great. But yeah, we have some really good questions in the chat that I guess I'll just start from there and then kind of we can see where we go. So one question's on the interface design and promise of AI companions. So that constant availability, validation, frictionless intimacy, great way to phrase it, as a form of relationship disinformation. Companions promising a soulmate, but offering like a relationship that's not realistic or desirable in the real world given the extreme asymmetry. So that's really well put. But yeah, Alan, any thoughts on that and how that's kind of proliferating and how we can kind
Yeah,
of
so I think we have
combat
to
it?
get back. This is a human problem, right? And we're trying, and I do think so. I'm not anti-AI. I think AI is hyper dangerous. I think AI is tremendously dangerous, but I think it also is a tremendous value. So I think we have to be skeptical and careful with how we deploy it. With respect to AI, there are people who look, there is a lot of trauma in the world right now. I mean, there's always trauma in the world. People individually are grappling with trauma. Probably everybody in this chat is dealing with some internal trauma. That's human systems. In a nutshell, that's the human experience. We also have messy relationships. So every single human, and I literally teach this course on interaction and interpersonal dynamics. So like human relationships get messy because of conflict and things like that. Um, and we're all have anxiety, and the anxiety has been amplified partly because we're still dealing with post-pandemic stuff, partly because the world is intentionally chaotic from some actors who are profiteering from chaos. Part of it is because, we started down the social media path and we withdrew into it, and so we have like dopamine needs and all this stuff. So there's a lot going on in our world that generates a lot of anxiety, and when we're anxious, trying to find some soothing mechanism there is important. And a lot of it can be done through friendships, community. The old traditional methods would be groups, social networks. Some people would do religious engagement, some people would do even sports and things like that, where there was some social engagement in a human context, and we didn't have the phones to retreat to. Now it's really easy to retreat into a phone. And particularly so because Hillary, you and I are arguing, like, there's tension between us. There's always tension in some human relationship. It's super easy to withdraw into something that is coded by design to appease me.
Right.
And so there's this insidious thing about the coding and sycophancy where I will always retreat to it because it's always comforting. And if I retreat to you, you might challenge me. You might make me indulge shame. You might make me indulge self-reflection. And that is, albeit very helpful in a long-term setting to do reflection, to sit through dissonance, to feel uncomfortable. We learn more in discomfort than we do in comfort. I mean, anybody who's done any social psychological work knows that discomfort is where we do most learning. And so if we're not allowing immersion in uncomfortable dialogue with people who do care for us, and we constantly retreat into the sycophant thing, that is really dangerous, just from a psychological. And this is before we introduce things like uh, the hallucinations, and the biases and the way that certain apps can be manipulated if we put in enough content to steer us down rabbit holes and things. So I think I am very cautious of the AI apps with respect to their ability to soothe us around anxiety and to offer consultations for therapy. I think that's a particularly insidious. I think there needs to be some human intervention at some point, a check-in, um,
Yeah.
something that sort of grounds. I don't want to take the human out of the loop there, and I certainly don't want that to completely pull you from your human system, because then you might find yourself trapped there, and you might refuse any angle on other interventions that might be more healthier, the healthier.
Yeah, and your point about the growth coming from the discomfort, if you're only in this kind of comfort zone, then you're stifled. Like you're just kind
Yeah.
of
And this
um
is also before we even introduce the incentives of the people who are coding those apps in the first place.
right. The point about, okay, well, where does this data go now that they
Yeah,
know that I'm
yeah.
lonely or whatever?
Yeah,
You
who
know,
owns the app? Who owns the app in the first place? What are their incentives? Are they for profit? Are they trying to sell me something? Are they selling my stuff to some master manipulator who wants to abuse me? I mean, these are real plausible scenarios.
yeah, I love that our the person on the webinar posted like the ordinary partner and the replica partner in the chat, but the ordinary partner doesn't have like doesn't sell your data and replica doesn't have like probably is selling your data or wants something, like the way that they're able to kind of break it down without, really facing the fact of what the reality is. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right to question kind of all of that. And another question that kind of came up. So if AI is compounding issues which had already been growing, regarding distrust, anxiety, which you've spoken so I think honestly about, and I totally relate to what you're talking about. And then if people are turning to AI due to that anxiety, what are the solutions that we should champion and try to kind of break the cycle? So I think you spoke about kind of that collective movement a bit, but is there anything, I mean, that's kind of like grander. Are there individual things that we can do as individuals and then also the collective action? Um,
Yeah, I think this is fundamentally, first of all, a lot of this, we don't need AI, we don't need phones. So everything I've talked about has been done throughout history. There is nothing new to any of it. I can manipulate you, gaslight you, confuse you, cognitively impair you face to face in person easily, especially now that I've studied it. So it'd be super easy to do for most people. And this is really about the technology amplifying that capability and making it more expedient and making it more accessible and also doing pairing. So it used to be harder for you to believe in some belief system because the people around you might be like, come on, Hillary, that doesn't make any sense. And for you to reach somebody who would affirm it, you'd have to like drive somewhere.
yeah,
Now you can access it immediately
yeah,
just by typing, and they might be in, who knows, Pakistan, Japan, wherever. They could be anywhere. And but now you're bonded. And then now I can introduce an AI thing to meet you there anywhere, anytime, 24/7. So I mean, these are the kinds of things. So to your question about how to intervene, I think we really need a movement about we need human connection,
yeah,
and human engagement in systems. So I mean, I was a US military pilot. I can't tell you how many times I was told we're going to replace the pilots. And yes, there's drone technology. I get it. You could probably fly airplanes drone. I don't know how many of you would step into one. I know people are doing Waymo in San Francisco. I
yeah,
would
true.
never go into a Waymo. No
Yeah.
offense, Waymo. I won't get in your cars. There's something about, even though I know that humans are fallible and most airplanes crash because of human error, there's something about a human intervention in the system because when the system breaks, we used to train, the system will always break. All systems are fallible. They will always break. There's always a weakness. So we need humans to dissect it, to first to understand it, to recognize it, and to intervene, and to then get into redundancy or whatever. So I think we need humans interacting in the entire interface around this, who we trust in a governance and framework. So a lot of the work that we can collectively do is around the governance of this stuff, which I think has been completely abandoned fundamentally. And certainly there are very powerful governments that have no interest in intervention around governance right now because they're profiteering, probably. The other thing I think we need to do is say, hey, we do need humans in human interactions. Like we should never have a purely AI relationship. AI can be a tool to support human interventions. For example, you could have AI check-ins that could then inform a human interaction. If I were doing therapy, I might be able to do some Q&A through an AI interface, get some basic data, and then you and I could sit down face to face and work through the data together. But then I'm doing the pastoral care
Mm,
as a therapist. So I think keeping the humans in the system and then also introducing um, more social communal engagement where we put the phones away, things like that. And I think there is, at least in the younger generation, some groundswell movement there. And this is before we also talk about the data center issues and the
yeah.
environmental issues that arise around AI as well.
Yeah, true. We haven't even gotten to that part of it. Um, Another question, kind of touching on the political ripple effect. What could be the low-hanging fruit that politicians can use to fix that psychological contract that might have been broken? So they're saying it seems like a tall order with a combination of Brandolini's Law and media smashed together. And then we also have a devil's
Yeah.
advocate question that I can follow up with after if you see
Okay.
it.
Yeah. So here's the problem with politicians. Many of them are conflicted. So a lot of the politicians are exploiting the systems. So a lot of the politicians are the problem.
Hmm.
And they are the ones who can create the solutions, but they have absolutely no incentive to do so because they're the ones exploiting the weaknesses in these systems. And we see that particularly in what I call mafia states, which are basically nation states that have been corrupted by organized crime syndicates. And I spoke in European Parliament about this last year. The classic example people attribute Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, things like that. But you can see it doesn't even have to be nation state actors. There are people who are in power who get exploitive juice. And so they're the ones who can actually do work on this, but yet they don't really have the incentives to do that work because they're profiteering or they're exploiting that. I think in order to move politicians, you have to move, going back to this notion of movement, there has to be a social movement.
Mm.
I think we're seeing some undercurrent. Now, I want to be careful. I don't want to over interpret and over, like, there's a bunch of probably well placed, maybe propaganda clips of commencement speeches in the United States. The ex Google CEO, there's other people who have said, hey, we're pro AI, and they're getting booed by the students. And people are interpreting that as this groundswell of anti-AI sentiment, at least in the United States, particularly from the younger generation. Um, I get the sense that that exists, but I might be over interpreting that data.
Mm.
But I think my point with this is that if there's an emotional movement for change, then that might move the politicians into more action around this. But I actually think it's more of a people movement. I think the people will lead the movement, and I think the governance infrastructure is going to have to come from general social norms. I think the easiest way, for example, to hold companies, corporations accountable is to not use their product.
Yeah, and I think that kind of hits on the devil's advocate question from that um, listener or the attendee that like, tech firms or politicians be accountable for this? And you're kind of speaking to the tech firms and the way to affect them is, if we're their consumers, then we can vote with that power is kind of what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's different, I have different thoughts on this. So my answer is absolutely. I think everybody should be held accountable, period.
Yeah,
I
like
think
yes.
yes.
Yeah.
So if you are intentionally, even if you're unintentionally, if you're negligent, you should be held accountable. If you are contributing to harms that are demonstrable, then yes, you should be held accountable. That's a general rule that I have. I mean, it could be an apology, it could be paying medical bills or whatever, but I think you should be held accountable. With respect to tech, I think there are ways in which we could trace, and I think there's enough evidence to trace their culpability in real harms, particularly in the second stage of the action. So a lot of people call this censorship, but it is not. There's a speech act, and then there is a subsequent act, which is a decision to amplify it or
Right.
decelerate it.
Yeah.
So the secondary act is a profit act. So if we put speech into the system and it was fundamentally equally pushed through the system, then they are simply a distribution pathway,
Yeah, but they're
and
not.
that's it. But they're not, they're an amplification choice thing, which is a profit oriented. If that is traceable to harm, then I do think there is accountability there. And that's before we even layer on incentives beyond profit. I believe, and I think there's evidence which I won't go into, I believe that in some very specific cases, some of them are actively part of corrupt acts intentionally. So I look at the entire meta system, and this is why we're bringing in the corruption lens. So if I
Mm.
were hypothetically to purchase a media group, which we're seeing some of these actors doing. Let's say that I'm going to purchase a major television network, or I'm going to purchase
A
a
newspaper.
platform, and then I immediately channel narratives that immediately lure people in, and then I immediately start marketing crypto scam, or immediately start marketing, um, you know, anti-democratic language or seditious by the local laws. I'm not pretending to be an attorney here, but I'm now seeding fundamentally anti-constitutional narrative through that, then I might be, from a legal perspective, committing a crime. And so this is part of a conspiracy for actual corruption in a legal, prosecutable sense. And
Mm.
so I think we need to start thinking about, and this is where we're bringing, by the way, the 2027 summit will go at this. The 2027 summit is about what are the fundamental big picture incentives for some of these campaigns, and is it to do money laundering? Is it I believe that we could trace some of these campaigns to human trafficking. to sexual trafficking to crypto. I see it all the
Fraud
time,
with crypto.
crypto,
Yep.
crime with
Yeah.
crypto. So thinking in terms of where's the responsibility there, and this also opens us up into things including monopoly, antitrust. So there's a lot of tools that have nothing to do with the speech. I'm sorry, it has to do with the speech. It's not trying to control the speech. The speech is simply a tool for a larger corruption act, and we're then engaging on the corruption act. And that's something that we're really bringing to the table and I think this is where policy can engage a lot of what are the incentives, and this gets even into, and I know I'm talking too long, and I want to get to more questions, but even I go back into the AI thing. Every single time I see anything AI, I'm like, who owns it, and what are they doing with the data?
Mm.
Simple
Yeah.
question. What are they doing with the data? And is it violating some law that could then be prosecutable? And can we hold them accountable for that? And I think, we're starting to see some evidence of that in, with Nudify apps and things like that.
Yeah. No, I think I'm glad you went a little bit longer and kind of talked about the summit because my personal next question was going to be, well, how can we dig deeper into that? So that's fantastic. Maybe one last one before we hit time. Is there anyone that you're kind of seeing in the chat, Alan, that would be good? But
Oh,
one person
Lord, I
was a
haven't even looked
bit,
at the chat.
one person was let's add on like kind of end on more of like a optimistic-ish one, where it's kind of what can we do to enhance our natural and unaided powers of discrimination in truth versus untruth, given this is what's going on. So maybe that's a takeaway for all of us.
Okay, so one of the things I want to get clear is we may not be able to do truth. And this is really important. We use this word, even my field, I'm very careful when I talk to my colleagues. In most cases, we don't know what truth is.
Mm,
We don't know. Like, we don't know what happens after death. We don't know. There's many cases where we don't know truth. In fact, it is very comforting when we do. Like, we know that
yeah,
if I drop something, it will fall. That's truth. It's extremely
gravity.
rare
Yeah.
where we really do know truth. Now, there are cases where we know somebody is lying because there's evidence. In many cases, there's evidence that points towards truth. And I think the evidence is very powerful. So there are cases where there's such a body of data that supports the primary logical inference that this is most closely aligned with reality. And I think that's an issue. And I think we should be really talking in terms of evidence, 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 evidence. And so holding people accountable to evidence, what's your evidence? And then evaluating the evidence, I think could be powerful, and demanding evidence, demanding what is the case you're basing your inferences on instead of I'm asserting it as possible, plausible. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other thing too, when we move into a frame around whether there's ambiguity around truth, which is in most cases, instead of focusing on truth, focus on why are you communicating this to me?
Hmm. Like what's in it for you, kind of a
What's
thing.
in it for you? So whenever I work, especially with children, so they preserve agency, because I have zero interest in telling people what to believe. It is not my place to say, oh, you're being manipulated. Ideally, you'll arrive at your own assessment of it. Preservation of agency is critical. So, what I want you to ask yourself is who's reaching out to me? Why? Why did they find me? How did they find me? What channel did they use? What data, critically important, what data did I leave for them to find me? What did I tell them about me for them to reach out? What was their message? Does it seem plausible? Is there any way I can get any veracity around it using real sources, things that I trust? Um, and again, coming back to what's in it for me, what's in it for them? Am I going to lose here? Where am I vulnerable? And if you ask those questions, then I think it gives you a lot of ammunition to say, oh, you know what? I really just don't want to listen to this, or let me unpack instead of unpacking the narrative. Let me unpack your incentives.
Mm.
So I
Mhm.
get a lot of people telling me stuff, and I'm like, why are you telling me this? And they're not prepared for that question.
I think that's a great place to end, actually, because now we can kind of think the same thing, and kind of take that away because, having something to arm ourselves with, put the power back in, and just give us time to like let things you question what we're being given, really, which is
Yeah. Always look to
Great.
incentives. Always, always question people's incentives. What is in it for them? Why are they collecting this data? Why are they telling me this? What objective do they have? What's their agenda? Always ask that question. I think it's more powerful than what they said.
Right. Yeah, and it puts us back in more of a place of control, really.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
It's
fantastic.
preservation of agency, I think, is critical. Preservation of agency is critical. And the weird part is they're going to falsely claim that we're doing censorship, which is them saying you're surrendering, you're stealing agency. And I'm like, no, no, no. I'm not
Like you
here
got
about
it. I'm giving it back.
I'm not here about speech. I'm handing it back, and we're just here about your corruption. I want to know about your corruption. I don't care about your speech.
Yeah, that's a great angle on it. So that's fantastic. I think we'll have some resources to share back with
Yeah,
everyone
we got
who's
tons and tons and tons of stuff. So, and
amazing.
we've been working hard, and it's an extremely authentic community. We're really, really trying to understand this and deconstruct it and find useful interventions. So, anything that you folks have, we'll work with you on it.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Alan. This was really just fantastic. Personally, it's a topic I've been thinking about for such a long time, having grown up in B2B media and online media. So, yeah, just really appreciate this. And we'll share all the resources out with the group and people that signed up. And just really excited to continue to follow this journey and see how we can support you.
Great. Well, thanks, Hillary. Appreciate it. Thanks,
Thank
everybody, for
you.
coming too.